So I want to walk through a little bit about what we're seeing collectively at MEO and the CDRM in the Canadian ecosystem right now on the eve of an election. I just want to start with the Hogue Commission's findings. So we went through a commission on foreign interference, a public inquiry over a course of a year. It began as an inquiry into Chinese interference. It expanded into India and Russian interference. But it began with discrete acts of foreign interference and incidents of attack into the Canadian ecosystem. And it ended and it concluded in a really different place. In particular, that the one I believe threatens the very existence of our democracy is disinformation. A big piece of that final report is not about discrete threats from foreign actors. It's about the overall health and vulnerability of our ecosystem. And that's what we try and understand at the observatory. So what do we know about this threat? The threat to disinformation that Justice Hogue says threatens the existence of our democracy. Well, I think it's good to start with our first report. We began this project sort of in the shadow of the American election in 2016, when everyone started worrying about foreign interference and disinformation. And we studied the 2019 election with a fair amount of anticipation and fear and concern that it was going to be a lot like the US election in 2016. And it wasn't. The lesson we took from that election in this report was that Canada was actually pretty resilient. We had fairly low effective polarization, fairly low siloing of information or filter bubbles in the Canadian ecosystem. We had a lot of trust in journalism and media and really high consumption rates of journalism in the Canadian ecosystem. But that was in 2019. And fast forward to now, almost everything that we said gave us resilience is either gone or getting much, much worse. So I want to go through three things that we've seen change since 2019. One is an utterly transformed landscape for journalism, traditional journalism produced by mainstream media outlets in its sort of core. I mentioned that in 2019, we had high levels of trust in journalism in Canada. And our thesis in that report was that this served a moderating effect to things that were going on online. So if you go on the internet and you see a piece of disinformation or a false fact or a conspiracy theory, but you also watch the news that night or read the newspaper the next morning, that plays a moderating effect to the crazy thing you saw on the internet. And it's not a huge effect, but it's enough, we think, that sort of protected us from some of that crazier stuff on the internet. And that requires high consumption levels of traditional media and high trust in that traditional media. And we had both, and we've lost both. We're now much closer to where the US was in 2019 than where we were, which, as the Americans will say, that might be a canary in the coal mine for something else. The other big thing that changed is our biggest two social platforms, Instagram and Facebook, turned off news. We can get into the reasons why they did it, but they did it, and we can see the effect of it. And this is the effect. Links to national and local journalism were essentially eliminated on the two biggest platforms for sharing them previous to the block. And we can see what this did in the Canadian ecosystem. And it's pretty astounding. We had a loss of 11 million views of journalism a day in Canada. So that's 11 million times someone would have seen a piece of journalism on Facebook or Instagram is now gone. That incidental viewing of journalism. Almost half of all news media engagement on all platforms, not just Facebook and Instagram, have gone away. And a quarter of all news outlets in the country have stopped posting on all social media entirely. Again, the place where people get their information. And those are almost entirely local news outlets. And finally, Canadians haven't noticed that this has happened. So we've lost 11 million views of journalism a day in Canada. And when you ask Canadians who say they get their news from Facebook and Instagram, they say they still do. The second thing that's changed is Silicon Valley has changed, and social media companies themselves have changed. And this isn't just performative alignment with Trump or Tesla car dealership ads on the White House lawn. Something has fundamentally changed in the posture of Silicon Valley to this whole set of issues we're talking about. And I think it's a number of things worth flagging. One, we've ended a 10-year period where trust and safety and content moderation were actually things the companies were trying to do. Now, they were doing it imperfectly, and a lot of people here, including myself, have been very critical of how they've done it. But at least there was a pretense that they thought these were issues. And that pretense is gone. Trust and safety teams have been disbanded across platforms, and content moderation is now being replaced either by completely ineffective crowdsource methods or automated detection using AI, which has also proven to be really imperfect. We've gone from minimal transparency of these platforms for researchers and journalists to no access to journalists and researchers. So the APIs that gave access to this community and others to access to some limited amount of data from these platforms have been turned off. And we're seeing actually a persecution of researchers doing this work in the United States from the highest levels of the US government. We're seeing a detachment from regulatory obligations of these companies. So again, there was a pretense of compliance. I think we're going to see in Europe the DSA, whether or not it can be enforced or not, whether or not companies will comply. We're about to see it in the Canadian election, where Canadian election law, whether companies will comply to add transparency provisions, for example. Are companies going to comply with that anymore? They did in the last election. Is Meta this time? We don't know. Is X? Almost certainly not. And finally, I think we're seeing, and this really comes out in some of the MEO data, a segregation ideologically, not just within platforms, but between them. That platforms are able to torque the overall character of their ideological composition from the top. The very things that people worried were going to happen are actually happening, but they're happening in a conservative bent now. So we see this in Canada. This is total engagement with political actors in Canada. And since Musk took over Twitter, or X, we've seen a 50% increase in conservative engagement on X in Canada. And that's totally irrespective of the number of users or the popularity of the candidates. It's an algorithmically driven increase in engagement in conservative content on X in Canada. On the regulatory obligation front, we really are seeing companies just not respond or not comply. The case of the Kirkland bots in Canada, where there was this concern that there was an automated bot campaign promoting the Conservative Party. A letter from 4 candidates, or 4 MPs, went to X, and it just got no response, right? So not a huge issue, but there's no longer points of contact for which to have dialogue with these companies anymore, and I think that's a really big change in posture. The third thing, the last thing I'm going to go through, is new pathways of manipulation. The first is that we're seeing a really unique combination of technological capacities, which is really cheap bots combined really critically with AI. So it's not just that we can get bots, and we've always been able to use bots on these platforms, but it's they can now operate on their own. And this is what we saw in the Kirkland bot campaign in Canada. So for the non-Canadians, Kirkland is a small town in Ontario. For the Canadians, Kirkland is also a small town in Ontario, where Pierre Poilievre, the leader, showed up at a rally. And that night, X was flooded with these kinds of comments from hundreds of different accounts, just saying how awesome that rally was. And they're totally innocuous, right? They were like, that was an amazing rally in Kirkland, Ontario. But they all happened at once. They all happened in a 24-hour period. And what happened was the Liberal Party blamed the Conservative Party of running a bot campaign, and the Conservative Party blamed the Liberal Party of running a false flag bot campaign. And that was the media story for 2 weeks, right? Whose campaign was this? We looked into it, and it turns out it's almost certainly just a person playing with a new bot tool. And they trained the bot tool on an RSS feed, a news feed. And that RSS feed, the day they hit go on this tool, picked up a Kirkland Lake news story that campaign had happened, started commenting on it on its own, and then just generated into this spiral of activity as people started picking it up. So probably just one person playing around with a tool, but I mean, talk about new pathways of vulnerability. What could you do with not 1,000 bots at 20 cents each, but 10,000 bots or 100,000 bots at that price? The second, which Marcus mentioned, which we fully agree is the biggest new vector here of vulnerability, which is influencers. And there's 2 attributes of them that are really important. They're utterly unaccountable to both anything other than their audiences, their poor audiences, who are often believers, and their funders, who are very often opaque. I mentioned the ad transparency laws that came in 2019 in Canada, forcing platforms to disclose ad spends during an election, digital ad spends. That was closing a loophole that we saw exploited in 2016 in the US, right? That you could opaquely fund digital ads and micro-target in a way that wasn't captured by other campaign finance laws. What we've now seen is money flowing from foreign governments into influencers in an entirely opaque way. And the key example of this is the tenant media case, which, I mean, I'm sure everybody knows about it, but it's quite striking in the sense that millions of dollars were funneled into a range of influencers in an entirely opaque way. The only reason we know about it is because of a US indictment. And what we found when we looked at the people who were funded and the podcasts that they were funded for is that Canada was talked about over 1,000 times, almost exclusively in a way that portrays Canada as a failed state. So this wasn't even aimed at Canada. It was clearly aimed at the United States, but the influencers that were captured in this net of money also directed their aim at Canada. This is Tim Pool, who is sort of at the center of this. After we destroy the Canadian economy, their resistance will erode. We will then march in unopposed and deliver Canada to its rightful place as a territory of the US. Crazy, but funded by Russia. Finally, is America. We are now seeing the emergence of America as a major actor in disinformation. We saw it in the UK, we saw it in Germany, and we're almost certainly going to see it here, and we're starting to see signs of it already. One of the idiosyncrasies or defining attributes of the Canadian media ecosystem is that we are deeply intertwined with the American one. This has always been the case. And in the digital ecosystem, it's even more so the case. And we really saw some of the harms or risks of this during the COVID pandemic. One of our studies found that 50% of the false information about COVID that was circulating in Canada originated in America. And that's because there's different incentives producing that kind of COVID anti-vax content and misinformation in the US, and it just flowed into the Canadian ecosystem because we're interconnected. And that is also a vulnerability. I started with the Hogue Commission, which began as an inquiry into Russian, Chinese, and Indian interference in Canada. Over the course of that commission, and in the last few months, Canadians are now more concerned about covert foreign interference from the US than any of those three countries. And that's what we're heading into in this election. Just to wrap this, a couple sort of overarching thoughts for maybe us to think about through the day and tomorrow. One is that I really do think that our ecosystem is this profoundly precarious situation. We're vulnerable on a host of fronts, and we have not put in place the sufficient protections to ensure its integrity. Core to this is the collapse of reliable information. There's just no question that the disappearance of journalism and the degrading and the lack of trust we now have in journalism is playing into this on the demand side of the problem. This clearly leaves us vulnerable to malicious actors. It is definitely going to get more tumultuous. I think the election's going to be a real crescendo for this issue. And at the end of the day here, and this is something that I would put to everybody over the next couple of days, is what does it mean for us to have a sovereign digital infrastructure that we can regulate and control and protect? And it probably doesn't mean one that's as intertwined with the American one as it's always been. And that, like Jennifer said, like the challenge to our economic integration, there's a challenge to our information integration. And it's not obvious what we do about that.